Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing marvelously well. Sitting here with the rather wonderful Mr. Chris Whitten. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. Freezing cold in sunny England.
Well, what is it? It's early evening over there?
Yeah, about 7:30, yeah.
7:30. Well, thanks ever so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
All right, it's a great pleasure.
You have played with some of my favorite artists, and you've recorded with some of my favorite artists, and you've toured with some of my favorite artists.
Right.
And I'm really excited. If you don't mind, I want to sort of go through the discography and sort of talk about, a lot of these records. The first thing that jumps out here, of course, is Julian Cope's solo album, Fried.
Oh, right. That is a weird one.
I know. How did you end up with that? For those of the people that don't remember Julian Cope, we're talking lead singer of Teardrops Explodes,
Right.
Which was a big band in my childhood in the 80s. Huge.
Yeah, it's some big hits.
Big hits. How did you get that gig?
I just set myself up as a freelancer in London, and people used to call me randomly to play drums on records, and that was one of those random phone calls. I obviously knew Teardrop Explodes and was a fan, but the name Julian Cope didn't really mean anything to me. And I just got a phone call out of the blue. This guy, Julian Cope's doing a record. Would you be able to play drums on it? So I went up to Liverpool. They were living in Liverpool. I went up to Liverpool, had a meeting with them, got on really well with them. And then we ended up in this studio space ward in Cambridge and did this album. The music was very odd. But I really got on with the guy, the producer, Steve Lavelle, who was a guitarist and producer. I really got on well with him. And I just played drums on the tracks for about a week or so and then left the project, and they continued on with it. And then years later, they always used to laugh at me because I was just like a young whippersnapper drummer lad, and I think they were all tripping on acid the whole album.
That's why it was weird.
I never even knew. there was occasions where I was playing a drum part and Julian would be crawling naked across the floor in front of the drums, and I just thought he was an eccentric, but I think he was off his head at the time.
Well, that was a baptism of fire.
Yeah.
And then How to Be a Zillionaire, ABC.
Yeah, just another freelancer job, and just got a phone call. And I really love the Lexicon of Love album. I'm not really big on commercial pop, but I'm a huge Trevor Horn fan. And I just thought, if you're going to have commercial pop, you can't get any better than that. There were catchy, really good catchy songs. David Palmer, the drummer on that's fantastic drummer. The production was amazing. And so I loved that album. And when I got the phone call, ABC want you to play on one of their records, I was really excited. Plus the album before, they'd had Andy Newmark on drums, which was amazing as well. Beauty Stab, great drumming. So it was a little bit of a disappointment because they were doing the whole album with Fairlight, and it was all like programmed stuff. And I ended up playing just like a Bo Diddley floor tom beat on this track, 13-Story Halo. So I would have loved to have done the Andy Newmark job, the real rock soul grooves, but I ended up just playing along with a Fairlight most of the time. But anyway, it was a thrill to work with them.
Those were the days. The Fairlight dominated.
When I started doing studio drumming, people weren't even really using drum machines. And then by the middle of the 80s, I was like competing for gigs with Fairlights. And every time I turned up to a session, there'd be a guy with this huge mansion of equipment and screens. And it'd be like, play the drums on this song. If we don't like it, we'll probably use the Fairlight version, or else we'll sample 2 bars of you and edit it up in the Fairlight. So it was like that. But I ended up playing on quite a few albums, so obviously it wasn't too bad.
The next one that jumps out, of course, is This Is the Sea, or the Waterboys. And
yes.
That's the opposite of the Fairlight for me.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a very
totally
organic, beautiful, open-sounding record.
Yes. Although, oddly, Mike's favourite drummer was a Lindrum. So I was competing, I think because he was a bit of a control freak, and so he would work on the songs and he'd program a simple part into Lindrum, and it was very hard for him to actually hand over the drums to the drummer. And so I had a difficult time making that record, actually.
You did?
And yeah, just because he he didn't really like me. He thought I was too much of a schooled musician because I've been to music college for 4 years.
Because you went to Leeds College of Music.
Yeah. So Carl got me in, Carl of World Party. He got me into the band. And Mike was always a bit sniffy about me because he thought I was too schooled. But, you know, the shows were great. Everybody loved the shows. But when it came to doing the album, he was very difficult about what I was going to play and everything. And then just the funny story to wrap that episode up was I spent about 2 weeks with them, not really getting anywhere. And then I left to do other things and they continued with the album. And then I got the phone call out of the blue. We're doing another track and we need drums on it. Can you come up to Liverpool? They were in Liverpool working at Amazon, mixing the album actually with Mick Glossop, the engineer Mick Glossop. And so I couldn't drive at the time. So I put my drums in a taxi, went to Euston Station, got my drums onto a train, got up to Liverpool, another taxi to the studio. And they played me this track. And it was like Prince, 1999 or something. And I thought, oh, this is right up my street. I love this kind of music. And so set up the drums, got a drum sound. I played it down one time and they all said, that sounds great, we'll do one. So the second take was what ended up on the record. And that was The Whole of the Moon, which was their biggest selling record of all time. So I had my revenge in a way.
That's great. Everybody's at their peak. Everybody gets to put their own heart and soul into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, The Whole of the Moon. I mean, that's pretty incredible. So 2 takes and they used the second one.
Yeah, the first one, it was such a simple drum part. The first one was basically fine. And they said, can you just do one more and put some different fills in? And I just relaxed into it and it just sounded better and I did some better drum fills. So I think they just ended up keeping the second take, basically, yeah. I mean, that was the thing. Being a studio drummer, you know, you had to do everything second, third take maximum. I mean, when I started out doing studio drumming, I probably thought I was a good drummer if I did 1 or 2 songs in a day. And by the mid-80s, I was doing whole albums in a day. I actually did a session with the American drummer Jerry Marotta, and it was a complete wake-up call for me because I did a few songs the day before on this album, and he was contracted to come in the next day to do some songs. And I spent ages on my songs and the drum sound was okay. He came in the next day. His drum sound was just absolutely phenomenal. It was so exciting. And I just had no idea what I was doing wrong until I heard him. I mean, when he set up the kit in the room, there was all kind of banging and rattling and ringing. But when you put it in the track, it just sounded amazing. And my drums were all very polite and tidy. But when you put them in the track, they sounded like a little box because of all the guitars and keyboards and everything. So I really learned a lesson. But I was so grateful that I got to spend time watching him, watching how he went about it. Anyway, and the other thing was he got the drum sounds and then he did the first song, they loved it. He did the next song and loved it. By lunchtime, he'd done like 5 songs. And I thought, oh my God, I've got to up my game. I can't be doing 2 songs a day. This guy could do 10 songs in a day easily. And so that was my big wake-up call. And I completely changed. I changed my sound. I changed the way I worked. And by the sort of mid to late 80s, yeah, I could do songs in second or third take. That was the thing, yeah.
What was the biggest change to your sound? What did you modify?
This is the annoying thing. I went to music college for 4 years doing drum kit, and I never had a lesson in tuning drums. It was all playing. It was all like copying drum solos and reading music and everything.
At Leeds, they didn't teach you how to tune your drums?
No. I don't know whether they thought I was a lost cause because most of the kids there were into jazz and I was into rock. And I don't know whether the lecturers just thought I was a lost cause, but I was never given a lesson tuning drums. And I never asked for a lesson. I just thought I could do it. I never really realized. And in those days, the music colleges didn't have recording studios like they do now. I mean, now if you go to a music college, you're in the studio and you can hear how bad you sound. But those days, I thought that sounded great. And nobody told me what heads to use. I didn't know what a rim shot was. all my snare hits were center hit because I grew up through disco and all that kind of stuff. And so I was just used to that very dead sound. And when I moved to London, I started doing recording sessions. All the American guys, Rick Marotta, Jeff Porcaro, Jerry Marotta, Andy Newmark, they had this explosive, and Tony Thompson, they had this explosive drum sound, rim shots, and kind of open sound, ringy toms and rim shotting snare. And my sound was completely the opposite. And the first few sessions I did were pretty disastrous, really. And I was panicking over the drum sounds, like putting gaffer on everything. And I just didn't know what I was doing wrong. And then I did that session with Jerry Marotta. Every snare hit was a rim shot. It was a complete revelation. I didn't even know what a rim shot was. His toms were ringing like crazy all over the place, all ringing together. And my toms were always like gaffered down. But as I said, when I went into the room itself, I thought this is going to be a disaster. And then when I went into the control room and listened to him playing down the track, it was so exciting. It was just incredible. And literally the next week, I started practicing rim shots. And I went out and bought all clear Emperor drum heads, which is what he was using, and coated ambassador on the snare. And I just completely changed my sound and completely changed my way of playing. It probably took me about 6 months to really perfect it because it was so consistent as well. Every rim shot sounded the same. There wasn't like a really ringy one and then a dead one, and there wasn't a loud one and a soft one. And so I had the rim shot thing going within a few weeks, but really to get it consistent took me about 6 months.
What was the first record that you really felt like you were able to showcase this new playing style and these new sounds?
And hard to know. Well, I was doing it on The Whole of the Moon, so I had it down by then.
Oh, fantastic.
Probably when I wasn't so good, I was doing a lot of albums in Italy. I was working at RCA Studios in Rome, and I sort of worked my way through it then. And then also Goodbye Jumbo, some of the earlier World Party stuff, I wasn't so good. I don't know, I probably perfected it more playing live because I was doing the Waterboys a lot, and then I actually joined Julian Cope's band, and I was doing Julian Cope a lot. So I probably more perfected it playing live. And by the time I did stuff like Swing Out Sister. By the time I was doing those records, I already had it pretty much down, and I was able to get a drum sound within half an hour, and I was doing 5 or 6 songs of an album during a day or a 4 or 5 hour session. So I probably perfected it playing it live more than in the studio.
So I was going to ask you about that because credit wise, I see that you have a live credit with Paul McCartney coming up next here. So how was that transition to playing with Paul live?
Well, that came after working with him for 2 years, actually. So,
oh, wow.
So I was doing Julian Cope. Well, yep. The way my career was progressing was I was doing these sort of alternative rock, sort of indie style bands full time. And then I was doing these pop sessions like Swing Out Sister, Hip Sway, and people like that. I was doing those, and ABC. I was doing those on off days, and that's what actually brought in the income. And so I was on tour in America with Julian Cope, and I had a message, can you call Paul McCartney's office? And that totally freaked me out. And I spoke, and with the time difference and everything, I had to wait to call them. So I eventually called them, got hold of them, and I spoke to somebody in his office, and he said, oh, Paul's decided it would be fun to do some sort of jam sessions in London over the summer. Would you be interested? So, oh yeah, I'd love to do that. God, amazing. And so they said, well, when you're around again, we'll let you know when it's happening, and we'll let you know to go to one. So I was back in London, and I got a message from them to go to this warehouse in East London. So I packed my drums in the car and went down there, set up the drums, and there was a bunch of people I'd never seen before, bassists and guitarists and keyboard players. I didn't know who they were. And we all set up, and we were standing round, and then suddenly the door burst open, and in walks Paul and Linda with a couple of other like entourage people. And then it's funny because you hear other people say this. I couldn't tell you anything that happened between then and when he walked out the door. It was just a blur, of the minute we were there for about 3 hours playing. And when he left, I couldn't remember anything about it. It was just I was probably so nervous, and it was just a complete blur. I actually said to one of the other guys there, this will be tragic if this is the only time I get to play with him, because I literally can't remember anything about it. Then very luckily, a couple of weeks later, they contacted me again to go down and do the same thing again. And this time I thought, I have got to soak it up. I've got to take it in, try and enjoy it. And so I did. And he was just playing, because, he loves all the old rock and roll, Buddy Holly and Little Richard and everything. So we were just playing that stuff. And I was like a 29-year-old drummer that had been playing with the Waterboys and Julian Cope. But actually, with the way I'd educated myself musically, I knew all the Chuck Berry stuff, and I knew Lucille and all that 20 Flight Rock and everything. And I think that really helped, because I knew what to do. And I always say to young drummers now, don't forget what's gone before you. You've got to realize that you're just an evolution of what's gone before. And it's really good to hear what people were doing 30 years ago or 40. I mean, Steve Jordan's great with all this stuff. He's preaches all this stuff about learning what the great rock and roll drummers used to do in the 50s. And that's how informed Ringo. It turned out that these were actually auditions, and that he was planning to do a new album, and he'd got himself a manager. He wasn't really being managed before. He got himself a manager, a guy called Richard Ogden, and he and Richard Ogden said, you are an amazing artist, Paul. The last few albums haven't been particularly well received by the critics, and they haven't sold that well. You need to be out there doing what you do best. And one of the things you need to do is just get a young band, get a young bunch of guys together, get back to almost your punk roots. They were a loud rock and roll band, the Beatles, when they played live. Get back to that, get away from all these session musicians. And so this was all part of an audition process of going through a bunch of young English musicians, like London musicians. Anyway, I was the only one that got hired. So
wow.
I don't normally blow my trumpet, but that was it. When we started the album, we needed somebody else. And so Richard Ogden suggested Hamish Stewart of the Average White Band. So when we started the Flowers in the Dirt album with Paul, it was just me and Hamish, Linda and Paul. So that was what came out of that summer. That was the band that came out of that. And then that album took 2 years to make. And then towards the end of the album, they started talking about this tour. And so actually, the first show of the tour, I was nervous, but we played the song so many times because Paul's got his own studio, he's got his own rehearsal place. We probably rehearsed for like 5 months on and off, and just played nearly every Beatles song that he could think of before he decided which ones he wanted to play on the tour. So when we got to the first show, which was in Oslo, in a stadium in Oslo. I mean, I'd never even done a stadium show before working with him, because I was doing Julian Cope and it was theatres and things. So when we got to the first show, I think I was very well prepared, but it was still quite an amazing thing to walk out on stage with Paul McCartney at your first show.
I cannot even imagine. I do have a friend, Brian Ray, who plays with Paul now. He got to rehearse, he told me, with the band for 2 weeks before he met Paul.
All right.
So you had that complete, I mean, I can't imagine doing it the way that you did, where you're just like, you're thrown in and then, you're jamming away and then boom, he just arrives.
Well, the most crazy thing was that in the middle of this audition process, towards the end of the summer, the office phoned me up and said, Paul needs a drummer at his studio. He's doing some music. Paul needs a drummer. Can you go down there? So I went down there, and he was doing his animation thing, the Rupert the Bear thing. And so we were just playing. It was like a sort of jazz thing, which I'm not very good at jazz. But I set up the drums in his studio. Then Jeff Emmerich walks in. I'm going to be engineering for the day. And then 10 minutes after that, George Martin walks in. I'm co-producing it with Paul and helping with the string arrangement and everything. And so literally the first recording session that I did with Paul McCartney had Jeff Emerick and George Martin, and that was just the most ridiculous situation to be in.
Well, I mean, what an incredible feeling, and probably incredibly nerve-wracking, yes?
Yes, it was. The amazing thing is sitting in the control room when they're all talking, you know, the stories come out. I mean, just incredible to be sitting in the room with all these people who've got the Beatles connection. I mean, I kind of had to be professional and just think about what my job was, because if you actually thought about the situation, you'd probably fall in a heap on the floor. You know,
sure.
How am I in this room with these people? I mean, you wouldn't be able to work.
Was this the Flowers in the Dirt record?
That was before that started. This was a Rupert the Bear animation. We were doing the music for that. It was a track called Tropic Island Hum, actually. Yeah, which was all like sort of marimbas and brass and strings and things. And then, yeah, towards the end of the year, I was never in the band. The office just kept calling me and asking me to do things. So I was never in the band. And then towards the end of the year, they called me and said, Paul's going to do a new album starting in January, and he wants you to work on it. And that was when I sort of became a member of the band. And that's when they hired Hamish as well. And so we worked for about 14 or 15 months on and off. Again, that was an amazing experience because Paul wanted to work with a bunch of different record producers. So we had Chris Hughes and Trevor Horn and Mitchell Froome and people like that coming in to work with us. So, yeah, it was incredible.
I can only imagine. I was looking at your credits here. You've got main personnel, drums, cymbals, hi-hat, tom-tom. Were they using the Fairlight? Is that why it's isolated in instrument? Then percussions?
No, it was all live. No, I think it's because Paul, he uses the studio as an instrument, obviously. And so sometimes he'd play drums on something when I wasn't there. Like the Trevor Horn stuff, he played drums on those. It was basically Paul and Trevor that did the track. They were just having fun one weekend kind of thing. And then towards, while they were overdubbing the track, somebody might have said, it just needs a bit of a drum fill there, or can you add a ride cymbal on the bridge or something? So I would just do that. So that's why I got credited for odd instruments. It's where I was doing or he would do a track where he was rubbing his hands together instead of hi-hats and tapping on a cardboard box instead of a bass drum. He always wanted to do experimental stuff. And so I might do a real hi-hat or a real snare drum on that. So I was basically playing full drum kit on everything, and it was all basically played live. Yeah, it was a band. He wanted it to be a band.
And then you've got some harmony, background vocal credits?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's basically a full-time job. You were there 5 days a week, and Monday to Friday, 9 till 5 kind of thing. And so, if we were doing vocals all week, there was no point in me just sitting there twiddling my thumbs. So we all got roped in to do backing vocals. And you've got to give the guy credit for, letting everyone get involved. And I
feels like a band, an actual band.
And I could say, I think you might have played a bass note slightly out of time and crazy stuff like that, But you just wanted it to be like a band, and you could do backing vocals, you could do bass synth on something, whatever. Otherwise I would have been 2 weeks playing the drums and then not on the album the rest of the time. So, we just used to convene every week and work through the music as a band. It was amazing.
When did you do the Swing Out Sister record?
Well, I was doing them on and off throughout the 80s, the late 80s. And I think I did at least one album while I was doing McCartney as well. I used to love those guys. I used to get on really well with them. And it was just a one-day session usually. And quite often they had everything finished. The drums were always the last thing to go on the record. And so they worked with programmed drums while they were making the record. And then they would get me in and I'd play on almost every song. And then they decide, we really like real drums on that song. We prefer the programmed drums on that song. And so I'd end up on like 4 or 5 songs, and there'd be programmed drums on 3 or 4 songs. And so it was great for me because when I was playing the drums, I was playing along to a finished record with it was amazing, rather than playing along to just a bass player chugging away. You don't know what the song's going to be. I was going in, the drums sounded amazing in my headphones and the tracks sounded amazing. So it was really exciting to do them. And actually, that was another personal highlight for me because they did that album with Jimmy Webb. And
fantastic.
So amazing.
What a songwriter. Woo!
And just the arrangements. It was just like being in the studio with Glenn Campbell or something.
Sure.
So that was an amazing
Galveston.
thing to do that. Yeah.
By the time I get to Phoenix, and of course, just the American Trilogy. Yeah, what a writer! That I can't. I've really wanted to work with Jimmy my whole life. Yeah. His songwriting and production is just absolutely incredible. Wichita Lineman is in my top 5 greatest songs of all time.
I love all the orchestral stuff and the Midnight Cowboy type stuff, and I just love it.
Yeah, that whole period, because this is going to segue nicely into the next record. That whole period of Beach Boys, Jimmy Webb, Van Dyke Parks.
Yeah.
Is very, very, with that, when you mix it in with classic Beatles and stuff like that, you do get one of my favorite artists, which of course is Carl Wallinger with World Party.
Oh, yeah.
And one of my favorite ever albums, Goodbye Jumbo.
Yes.
So you'd already, presumably that came from the Waterboys connection, but then was also reinforced by the fact that you're probably playing with Paul. I'm sure he was very excited.
No, not really.
No, you think so? You're big because you hear so much Beatles in World Party.
Oh, I know. He's massive on the Beatles. I don't even know whether we really discussed it that much. Right. No, I'd known Carl for years and years since I first moved to London. One of the first things I did was this unsigned funk band called Out, and we just used to do like warehouse parties and everything. And we auditioned in Melody Maker or something for a keyboard player. And Carl came along and auditioned, and we loved him, and he could sing amazing as well. So he came and played in the band. None of us were in any signed bands or anything. We were just playing pubs, the Half Moon in Putney and things like that. Going off on a quick tangent, but when I was really young, around 1980, I got to play in New York, CBGB and Max's Kansas City. And I mean, they've gone now. And I just missed the tail end of when they were really cool. But it was just amazing because at the end of, I know you've done some of this stuff in your classic tracks and everything. At the end of the 70s, I was so into Talking Heads and the B-52s and all that kind of stuff. And to find myself playing these places, the dressing room was a toilet and there was graffiti, Stiv Bators was here and all this kind of stuff on the wall. And it was just an incredible, be able to play those places. And the PA and the monitors were blisteringly loud. And it was pure rock and roll. It was amazing.
My overriding memory of CBGBs is that it was about this wide. It was so narrow. And the bar ran down kind of the middle.
That's right.
And so you'd have to like go past people to go up to where the band was playing, which was also tiny, and like bumped into people as they're trying to order drinks. But the funniest thing I remember is being on stage and the bathroom was just here. Right. So you're playing and the whole time there's just people walking past you, going in and out of the toilets.
Yeah, And the stage, as you say, was tiny, but the drum monitors was like a mini PA. It was just unbelievable. Anyway, it was good.
But it was cool.
So I was playing in this unsigned band. Then Carl came up to me one day and he said, "Oh, I'm going to join the Waterboys." And I went, "Oh, Christ, I'm stuck playing the Half Moon in Putney and you're going to be playing in this really cool band." So I was a bit annoyed about that. Anyway, he went up and did the Waterboys, and then their drummer left to join China Crisis. Do you remember them?
Of course, I remember China Crisis, yeah.
So the Waterboys needed a drummer, so Carl got me into the Waterboys. So we had this whole history through the Waterboys. And then when we both left the Waterboys at the same time, which was partly to do with the whole of the moon and the fact Mike claims he never said he would do Top of the Pops, but Carl and I thought we should do Top of the Pops, and he didn't want to do it. So soon after that, we left. And then I was in touch with him the whole time. I was doing Julian Cope, and I was doing all these sessions and everything. And I used to just go over to Carl's. He had a studio in his house. I just go over there and potter about. And I think I played on quite a lot of the songs on Private Revolution, but I didn't end up on the album because he either redid them himself or he redid them with another drummer months later. And so I was always hanging out with him. And so when I was working with McCartney, I think he just said, I've got this country house for the summer. Will you come up and play some drums? So I just went up. He had this place in Woburn Abbey. I went up there, and the only difficult thing about Carl is completely nocturnal. And so I was used to doing 9 to 5 with Paul. And when I went up to this house in Woburn, the first day he didn't get up till like 5. And then we started recording the song at like 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I had to turn my whole, it's not what I really want to do, but I had to turn my whole body clock around. So I was up there for a couple of weeks, and I played on a bunch of stuff when he was making Goodbye Jumbo. But I think I've only ended up on 1 or 2 songs, maybe even just 1 song on the album, because again, often he would decide to re-record the whole track months later with himself playing drums or with another guy playing drums. So I know I'm on that Ain't Gonna Come Till I'm Ready. I'm not sure if I'm on any of the, I originally played on a few of the songs. Way Down Now, I think he ended up doing Way Down Now with Chris Sharrock, who was obviously with Robbie Williams and people like that. I think he played drums on that, but I played drums on it at some point, but I got replaced. So he used to muck about doing songs loads of different ways until he decided he had an album finished, and then he put it out.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of his, huge fan of that album. And it feels like that. It feels like a classic record of a sort of, that period we're talking about in Britain and America, and sort of like 65 to 70, when people just went in and made records and did whatever was best. And beautiful to be involved in. You do have credits, I think, on 3 songs.
Okay.
You're an attributed artist. I think he names you as part of the band, in some ways. I remember buying the album, at the time and seeing your name all over it. So tell me about playing with Edie Brickell.
Right, so that was another mid-McCartney session. Actually, it was quite early in the recording of Flowers in the Dirt. I think it was probably Easter. It came out August 1988, and we started the album the McCartney album, January 1988. So that must have been an Easter holiday or something. In the 80s, when I was freelancing, Paul Wickens, who's Wicks, the keyboard player with McCartney, he used to recommend me for sessions. He was so kind. He got me on loads of amazing sessions, recommending me for stuff. And so I was doing the McCartney album. I had a phone call from Wicks. I'm doing this album with this new band from America, and we need a drummer. And I said, I'm busy doing McCartney. They said, you can do it over the Easter holidays. I'm sure you've got a week off. And I said, I don't really want to spend my week off in a studio with a band I don't know. Again, under pressure, doing long hours and everything. I just need a break. So I said, I'll get Pat, the producer, to call you. Pat Moran had produced Robert Plant and people like that and was used to working at Rockfield. So Pat phoned me up, and I'd never worked with Pat. I didn't know him. And he said, I've got this band. It's their first album. I'm not really happy with the drummer, and we really need to knock these songs out and get the drums sorted out. I'd really like you to come down. Wicks has recommended you. And I said, I'm busy doing McCartney and I've got a week off. I don't really want to spend it in the studio. I said, please come down. You'd really make a massive difference. I don't know what I'm going to do if you don't come down. And I said, well, I'll think about it. And I said, can you try harder with the drummer in the band? And he said, all right, we'll give it another go with the drummer in the band. And then he called me a few days later, stop working out with the drummer in the band. You've got to come down. So I ended up agreeing to go down to Rockfield. And I probably agreed to do it because my parents used to live about 20 minutes from Rockfield. And I thought, I could combine it with visiting them, and I won't have to sleep over if the band are up all night and stuff like that. So I went down and met with them, and it was awkward, because it was their first album, and they'd obviously been together as a band for a few years, got signed, and they were in the studio doing their first album, and the producer had vetoed the drummer who was standing there. And so it was a bad atmosphere. And I think the band had to agree to it, essentially. Well, as we were just saying, it was before Pro Tools, and so you couldn't fix the drums, you couldn't put samples on them or retime them. It just had to be done on tape. It was analog tape, no computers. I started playing the song, and Pat said, drums sound great, love the drums. Cymbals sound a bit clangy. Can you do it so you don't play hi-hat and cymbals? Just play the drums. So I started cutting the tracks, just playing the drums. I taped a foam pad to my knee so I could sort of keep time with my right hand and play the drums. And at the end of drum fills, I just sort of wafted at the air and made a mental note, I've got to put a cymbal there when we overdub the cymbals. And then, so we ran down the song. I'd never heard the songs before, listened to the demo, and then we ran down the song with the band. They were all playing as well. And they weren't really out of time, but one person was generally slightly ahead of the click. Another person was slightly behind the click. So I ended up saying to Pat, after I play the song once through to learn it and get the part right, you've got to take everyone out of my headphones apart from Edie singing, and I'll just work out where I am in the song based on the vocal. And so I played all the songs, just the drums, with no other music apart from vocal, basically. And it was another one of those ones where I probably did all the songs in 3 or 4 days again, because, you just had to do everything second or third take. Oh, the other thing was, he said, we can't pay you your normal fee because it's their first album and it might not sell any, and this is the budget. So I wasn't happy that I was going to have to work for less than my normal fee on my 1 week off. And I thought, Edie's really good. I like the vocals and the songs. I liked the songs. And actually, Brandon, the drummer, he'd come up with loads of really interesting drum parts. He's quite a unique drummer. And I've never been that good at coming up with, I'm more of a meat and potatoes. I've never been that good at coming up with innovative drum parts. So I just basically played what he needed to play. And actually, the problem that they had with him was he wasn't very consistent. His volume would go up and down, his bass drum would dip and then get loud again. And or he'd play one take and the producer would say, I love it, can we just do it again and change a couple of fills? And then the next take would be completely different. So the thing was, he just wasn't consistent for what the producer wanted anyway. And it's always a damaging situation like that, because he ended up being, obviously, understandably, incredibly pissed off. And I think he left the band while they were still doing the album. So they ended up with no drummer. Yeah, and then the album came out and the videos were on MTV, and the drummer on the first video was the previously unknown drummer Matt Chamberlain, who's now become absolutely enormous.
Do you have any specific memories of tracking What I Am? Obviously, that turned out to be a massive worldwide hit.
My favorite track doing the album was Little Miss S. I just really like that track. So I probably didn't really focus in on What I Am as being anything particularly special. I've never been that good at shuffles, and so that always makes me nervous. And it was handy. It was actually handy that I didn't have to do the hi-hat at the same time as the drums, so I could just concentrate on the shuffle drums. And I did that. That was quite a complicated. He did this like double hi-hat bounce where he did some amazing innovative drum parts. So he did this double hi-hat thing. And so, guitar riff comes in, then drums come in. And I'm just trying to think if there was anything special. It was just another song. And I was just gobsmacked when the album started to sell so well. And then that was just a massive hit single. I think it might have been, were they one of the first jam bands? I mean, jam bands are a thing in the UK, but they just kind of were like a jam band before they were signed by Geffen. They played out of Austin, Texas, and they just used to do like long versions of the songs, and they had a percussionist, and it was kind of jam bandish. And then were they one of the first bands that had that kind of sort of searing female lead vocal before Alanis Morissette and all that kind of stuff. I think it just hit a nerve when the album came out. I don't know.
For me, it's almost like pre-90s because she has that same kind of like nonchalant delivery, kind of almost pre-grunge way of singing. You know, she's just kind of like, you know, there was the Cowboy Junkies had it as well. There was just a couple of artists that had that kind of, I don't know the right way to describe it. It feels almost like it could have been from the grunge era. It feels like early to mid 90s American, but it's 88. So it was definitely a precursor to what was going to come.
I mean, they were not rock and roll at all. And she was not rock star at all. She was very quiet. She seemed very frail and sort of vulnerable. And the vocals were very sort of soft and high pitched and everything. And it was kind of like folk, wasn't it? And some of the guitar work on the other songs on the album is almost like African, like that African type of guitar playing. So, and then the bass player was playing like fretless, and it was unusual to have like a percussionist as such an integral member of the band playing on every song. And so, yeah, it was an unusual thing, but I just sort of ported in for 4 days and ported out. And I never thought really much more about it. And then all of a sudden, it's probably apart from like the odd McCartney thing, it's probably the biggest thing I've ever played on. It was massive, double platinum. But then a lot of people thought it was Matt Chamberlain because he was in the videos. And I wasn't credited on the album either. It actually says on the album cover, special thanks to, and a few of us, including me, get a special thanks. But it doesn't say drums, Chris Whitten. It just says, it doesn't say, or it might have said Brandon Allied drums, but it doesn't say that I'm the drummer. And then for a few years afterwards, everybody assumed that Matt had played the drums.
You're playing with Paul. You've got a couple of live albums that you're on. There's the Unplugged one, which came out, I think, in like 91. It was the official bootleg. But of course, you're on the Tripping the Live Fantastic, which I remember quite vividly in 90?
Yeah. Paul, he can do whatever he wants. And so when we started this tour, he had a whole recording set up, like a 24-track machine and an engineer at every show. So we recorded every single show. We recorded all the sound checks. We used to do a mini show sound check, which kind of irked me because I was knackered by the end of the sound check. There was no sound check. You didn't have time. You didn't have time to say to the monitor guy, I can't hear the bass or I can't hear the vocal, because it was just a full-on show. Because Paul just loves to play. It's a bit like Prince, you know, that kind of thing. He just loves to play. And so the sound check, he probably loves to play lead guitar more than anything else. And so the sound check would invariably be just him blowing on lead guitar and us playing along. And we'd either make something up or we'd do rock and roll or something like that. And so we do a 2-hour sound check. That was always recorded. And actually, they mixed some of those tracks and put them out as B-sides for the singles off the Flowers in the Dirt album, some of the stuff. And I got a writing credit because I was playing drums at the sound check. That was nice of him to give me a credit. Yeah. And we did All My Trials, amazing gospel song. We just jammed it at a sound check, and that ended up as a B-side. And then we do the show, and they recorded every show. So towards the end of the tour, they were sending the tapes to Bob Clearmountain, actually, and they got Bob Clearmountain to mix it. And this is the most stupid thing. And I've always been a bit on the naive side, but Paul said to me, I think you should go and see Bob in his studio and make sure you're happy with the drums. So I said, oh, all right then. So they flew me to Woodstock to go and meet. And again, I didn't treat him like a god or anything. I mean, I was a massive fan of Chic and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't, and he was already a massive mixing guy at the time, born in the USA and all that. But they picked me up in a town car kind of thing at the airport and took me to his studio. And I sat in his studio while he mixed one of the songs from Tripping the Live Fantastic. I don't even know whether I said anything because I just thought, I can't tell Bob Clearmountain that the drums don't sound right. So I think Paul wanted me to go there and be happy, which was very nice of him, be happy that I was okay with the drums. And I think I just sat at the back of the studio, and Bob very, very kindly didn't treat me like dirt and just let me sit there and put up with this drummer he'd never heard of.
Yeah, did you give him any kind of feedback?
I can't remember. I was probably intimidated. I mean, the thing was, he was known for putting his bespoke drum samples on everything. And so I was concerned that you'd lose the dynamic, because a lot of the McCartney show, I was hardly hitting the drums in things like Let It Be and The Long and Winding Road. I was hardly hitting the drums. Then Live and Let Die, I was absolutely thwacking them. And so I was concerned that there would be a really canon snare drum in the mix on Long and Winding Road or something, but it didn't really end up like that. I think in the end, he put a fatter snare sample on some of the ballads where it really needed a bigger snare sound, like Let It Be and Maybe I'm Amazed and all that kind of stuff. And then on the more rocky stuff, it's more of my own snare, I think. I had a really cracking snare sound on that tour because it was quite a loud show. People used to come to the show. One of the first shows we did a few shows around Europe, and then we came to America for Thanksgiving, and we did the Forum in LA at Thanksgiving. And I think Paul was really nervous because he hadn't played in America for like 12 or 15 years. That was the first time I really saw him nervous. He was a bit cranky with everyone. He was a bit cranky about the monitors and things like that. But we did this show, and before the first show at the Forum, somebody said, have you been in the green room? Because they used to have like a VIP area. And I said, no, I've just been in the dressing room. He said, oh, you've got to go in the green room. So I wandered down the corridor, opened the door of the green room. There's everybody who's ever been a star in Hollywood standing in the green room, including Jack Nicholson. It was just incredible. And then Stevie Wonder came up and sang with us. And anyway, later on in the tour, we were playing somewhere, and I looked off to the monitor desk halfway through the show, and Axl Rose and Slash were standing there. And now I thought it was funny because about 6 months later, they brought out their version of Live and Let Die, which was almost note for note identical to the way we were playing it on the McCartney tour.
Well, maybe that's what they were down there for, reconnaissance. That morphed into Dire Straits, or did you do them at the same time?
No, I sort of, again, being very naive, the whole time I was doing McCartney, I thought, I've done this for 3 years now, and I've been playing the same material on the tour and the Flowers in the Dirt album and everything, and I saw myself as a freelance studio player. And so towards the end of the tour, I thought, what I really want to do next is have a good 6 months or so going back to the studio and playing with different artists, playing different kinds of music. And then just after the tour, Paul's manager phoned me up and said, oh, Paul wants to get together next week, and we're thinking of doing some little low-key shows around the UK, little club shows. And I went, okay. And I hung up the phone, and I thought, I've only been off this tour like 2 weeks and we're already back on it again. And I phoned him straight back and said, I just can't do it anymore. I just need a break. I need to do some different things, which is probably, suicide note. It's the stupidest thing you could ever do. But anyway, he said, well, there's no point telling me, you'll have to tell Paul. So I then had to phone Paul and say, hello, Paul, I don't want to work with you anymore. It was just a complete nightmare. But I knew that's what I felt in my bones, that I would just be depressed if I went back to playing the same song, incredible songs. I mean, we'd reached the pinnacle. I mean, by the end of the tour, we were doing like 2 nights at Giant Stadium in New Jersey, sellout shows. We did 180,000 people at the Maracanã in Rio de Janeiro. And I just felt it was time to move on and do something else. So anyway, I stupidly did. So my idea was to either work as a studio musician in London or maybe move to LA or something, very naive. And it was in the process of sort of figuring out what I wanted to do when I got a call to do the Dire Straits tour. And I didn't really want to do it, to be honest, because I'd had enough of being on the road. And my manager at the time said, you'd be crazy not to do it. So I said I'd go and meet them. And they were in our studios mixing the On Every Street album. They'd seen me playing with Paul, and they decided that they wanted me to play drums on their tour. But there was a sort of audition where they got me to bring my drums to Air Studios, and they just finished the album, and I played all the tracks on the album as if I was doing the album again. But they played me what the drums were, and it was all Jeff Porcaro. It was mostly, there was a bit of Manny Cachet, but it was mostly Jeff Porcaro. And I just thought the drumming was, well, I'm a massive Jeff Porcaro fan as well. I just thought the drumming was amazing. And so I kind of persuaded myself that I should do the tour based on the fact that the drumming on their new album was amazing and I'd really enjoy playing it live. So, yeah, that's what I did. So I said I would do it. But so I ditched my plans of becoming a studio musician. And actually, you know, we were talking earlier about how I've ended up in Somerset and things like that. But basically, well, in those days, if you were on the road for like 2 or 3 years, you couldn't get back into the studio because the next generation had come up and the next hot studio drummer was around. And so really, I wouldn't have been able to get back into studio work at the end of the Dire Straits tour because I'd been on the road for like 3 years at that point. And a lot of the other guys were the same, like Wicks. He's mostly been playing, I mean, Wicks is a phenomenal studio keyboard player, but he's mostly been playing live. He's become Paul's musical director now. And since the tours that he's done with Paul, he's mostly played live. And actually that was kind of sensible because then once we got into piracy and Napster and everything, the money, the bottom fell out of the business recording wise, and anybody who was sensible was on tour. And so I did it the wrong way round. I was touring when everyone was making records. And then when I stopped touring, no one was hiring studio drummers anymore because then we had Pro Tools as well.
Yes, we had the ability to make drummers who didn't necessarily have good timing play in time. Yes.
Yes.
So I did gloss over purely by mistake Johnny Cash.
That was just a Paul thing. I mean, as I said, you were working with Paul 5 days a week, and some weeks he'd just say, "Oh, we shouldn't work on the album this week. Let's just jam some stuff, or let's do something else." And anyway, I think Johnny Cash was in London, and Paul was big mates with Johnny and June Carter Cash, and he was going to have them over for dinner or something. I think he probably said to them, "Why don't you come in the studio and we'll do a song?" And so we were in the middle of doing Paul's album, and one day Johnny Cash turned up and we did a song for him. So it wasn't like I was hired by Johnny Cash to play on his record. It was more like we were the house band when he was doing a record with Paul, really. But it was amazing to be in the room with him again.
Can't imagine what that would have been like.
It wasn't that good a song. I mean, I'm not a country drummer anyway, and so, you know, it's difficult. You're thinking to yourself, I probably shouldn't be the guy playing on this. I'm not doing it justice. It wasn't an amazing song, and it was just one day. And I think Paul thought it would be fun, and I'm not sure. Well, it ended up on his album, so Johnny must have been happy with it. But I mean, yeah, I mean, the thing was, every other week, somebody incredible was hanging out. I got a phone call. We used to work Monday to Friday, and I got a phone call from Linda on a Saturday. We're having a barbecue on Sunday. Do you want to come down a day early and come to the barbecue? So, yeah, that's great. Oh, that'd be good fun. So I turned up to this barbecue. I was talking to Paul, and I turned around. There was Steve Martin standing next to me, and he'd invited the comedian Steve Martin to the barbecue. So, I mean, you're just constantly meeting amazing people when you're in that kind of sphere of showbiz.
Cannot imagine. Steve Martin, I'm a huge fan of.
I was a massive fan at the time. Yeah.
I mean, what do you do? Do you ask like, "Hey, what was it like making the jerk? What was it like making Man with Two Brains?"
You don't say anything.
Exactly.
I mean, he wasn't very funny, and I think that's the thing, is that they don't want to be on. And so they just want to be treated like a normal human being. Paul knows all that. Paul's known Lorne Michaels for years and years and years. He knows all these people, Chevy Chase and Steve Martin and all those people. So it was just a barbecue. It was just a Sunday afternoon barbecue, and that's all it was. And I just generally try to keep my mouth shut.
It's hard when you're such a huge fan of these people, but yeah.
I mean, the worst thing, I'm not really one for being starstruck, and especially musically, because you can't really perform. If you're really nervous or worried, you can't really perform. So, yeah, I mean, apart from that one first audition with Paul where it all just went by in a blur, the second audition, I was just back being a professional. But we played in San Francisco with Paul, Berkeley, forgotten the name of a Greek auditorium or something in Berkeley anyway, across the river, across the bay from San Francisco. And I looked over after a couple of songs again to the monitor desk, and Narada Michael Walden was standing by the monitor.
Oh,
and he was probably my favorite drummer growing up, doing Mahavishnu. And then I was really into dance music and doing all the disco tracks and everything. He used to do he used to do his own disco tracks, and it was just 4 on the floor. And then right at the end of the fade out, he'd do the most incredible, amazing drum fill right at the end of the fade out, like a Billy Cobham drum fill. And I just thought he was incredible, plus all the Mahavishnu stuff. And so I saw him standing behind the monitor, and I probably played the worst show I've ever played for the rest of that night. I was just freaked out by the fact that this guy, and I had in my mind probably, I wonder if he's going to come backstage at the end and make a comment about my drumming or something. So I was second guessing everything and trying to do too much, and it was just a disaster. Anyway, kind of sadly in a way, I looked over during the encores and he'd gone, and he didn't come back afterwards. So I don't know if my drumming put him off or he just wanted to leave before the end. But
probably wanted to get in the car and get out of the traffic.
Think so.
We've all been to those shows, haven't we?
Yes.
Chris, thank you ever so much. This has been a blast.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm a big fan of your show. So it's such an honor to be on.
Well, we met through Instagram.
Yes. I was already watching and commenting on your YouTube videos and everything, but when I saw that you were doing the classic tracks, I think I made a comment and you wrote back to me and said, we should do something. And I said, but if you want to do more American classic tracks, then the Edie Brickell one is like the no-brainer for me.
Yeah, well, I think between that and, I mean, obviously it's a huge song, but Goodbye Jumbo, just any kind of involvement on their record's a big deal for me. It's interesting with Goodbye Jumbo because it hits such a diverse amount of people. I've done a few albums with Rick Springfield, and he loves 60s music, and he sent me a track to mix maybe a year ago, and I was like, wow, this reminds me, and he really knows his music. I was like, I love this. This reminds me of something off of Goodbye Jumbo, and without a breath, immediately responded back, love Carl Wallinger. So it's like, you can tell it's and I think for all of the 90s early 90s bands in America, like Jellyfish, started to get really big in England before they broke up. In the UK, they all love Carl Wallinger. They all love XTC. There's something about those bands that, you can feel their influences of not just the Beatles, which is obvious, but the Beach Boys, and like we're talking about Jimmy Webb and Van Dyke Parks, just that whole melting pot of great 60s music. Just absolutely fantastic.
I think with Carl, his big influences, the Beatles, especially John Lennon, Bob Dylan, Neil Young. So it was all like that. And that was the other thing that I used to argue with Carl, because I was coming from a studio drummer background, and he would make me play the songs like first take, and I didn't know the song. And I'd say, well, can we record it again now? I know where the chorus comes. I know where the bridge comes. And no, I don't want you to know where those things come. And there'd be like terrible mistake. And I'd say, I've got to do that bit again. And he'd say, no, that's my favorite bit. So it was frustrating to work with. But I was just going to say with Carl World Party, he was doing home recording DIY releases years before anyone. All those albums were done by him at home or in a house that he rented on a 24-track machine, basically virtually playing most of the instruments himself, and the odd person like me coming down and playing with him for a while. So Goodbye Jumbo was certainly, and Private Revolution were just done at home on his own, basically.
Well, thank you ever so much. I really appreciate it. Please, anybody leave some comments and questions below. I'll see if I can throw Chris under the bus to answer any of them. If you have any specific questions. Thank you, Chris.
I'll answer them.
There you go.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Have a marvelous time recording and mixing, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.